folks. Welcome to Walking on the Weene Side, part of It Matters Radio. And I'm Ken Weene, and today I have a very interesting guest. Her name is Jill Cody, and she has written a fascinating book called America Abandoned. And Jill is very concerned about what's happening in our country. I should tell you a little about her. She had a 31-year career in public service and politics, and she was personally trained by Vice President Al Gore to share his wonderful movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and the presentation that he gives. And she has been involved in coordinating national and international strategic planning on information literacy, and that's taken place in Washington, D.C., Prague, and Egypt. Jill Cody has a master's degree in public administration from San Jose State in California, and she was named a distinguished alumna in their College of Applied Sciences and Arts. And Jill, thanks for coming today to Walk on the Weene Side.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to talk to you, your radio listeners, your viewers. Thank you.
So, who has abandoned America?
Well, what I learned with 3 years worth of research is that it's really been the corporations and the billionaires who own them. And it started 40 years ago. I started to see the changes when I was working for the public sector. I just saw the change in our society in slow motion. So when I retired, I wanted to know what happened. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things that I saw in the societal change was when Ronald Reagan said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language was, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And I was offended because I was there to help. And everybody I knew that was working for the city that I was in at the time was there to help. And before that period, we had really good partnerships with the community, a good dialogue with the community. We felt we were working together. But then not too long after that was said, where Ronald Reagan pitted the public against their own government. And this is from somebody who had a government position and a government salary and a government housing and government security and, all of that pitted us against each other. I very soon saw people yelling at me at public hearings, like, I pay your salary and I pay taxes. And there was such an animosity that kept growing. And it's even worse today.
Well, I think it's terrible today. And I think, to be fair, though, wouldn't you agree that it has become more virulent on both sides, where at the one hand, yes, people are getting angrier and angrier at the government, but also the government is getting more and more detached from the public?
Well, I think that's true with this administration, but I also think it's true because of the clever messaging that has happened over the decades, because the messaging has really pitted American against American, a Democratic person against the Republican. We've had a TV station dedicated to that. We have radio stations dedicated to that all over the country, working at keeping us at each other's throats. And I think that while we were doing that, corporations and the billionaires were taking care of business and taking over government, capturing departments, making sure that their people were in there. When my research started, there was I feel a real beginning point in the what I call the Velvet Coup, was when Lewis Powell wrote the memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on August 23rd, 1971. And that was the launch. That was telling corporations that they better get involved in politics. And at that time, there were 175 lobbyists. Today, there are over 13,000. And when you think there's 485 people in the House and 100 people in the Senate, 585 people have 13,000 corporate lobbyists.
I think your number's off there. Isn't it 435 in the House?
435? It could be. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, but it is astounding how much money and effort goes in from primarily some other groups beside nonprofits and unions and such, but how much goes in from corporate America in lobbying. And often the goal behind that lobbying is to make sure that their particular industry can get more.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that was actually the second societal change that I saw. And that was the message that business can provide public services better. Business is more effective. Business is more efficient. Business can provide government services better. And I immediately thought, when I saw that happening, was that, how can anybody believe this? Business is sole purpose is to make a profit. The government's purpose is to assure the quality of life for its citizens, and they are opposite purposes. Not always, there can be some overlap, but generally the mission, the motivation, the intention behind each one are very different. But yet people started believing that business can do it better because of the messaging, the branding, if you will, that business is better. Yet business isn't transparent. If they make a mistake, it gets hidden in their bottom line. And government is very transparent. And right now with this administration, that's a very good thing. We know what's being said and what's happening and are very well aware of it. Now,
I'm not so sure I agree with you that government is very transparent. You try being a whistleblower in Washington.
Yes, it's more transparent. That's a good point.
More, yes.
More. And probably from my frame of reference, since I worked for cities, I see them much more transparent because the city council person is a friend and a neighbor or a business person in the community. So you're right. The federal government has been difficult, but on the other hand, other administrations let the visitor logs out. Who's visiting the president. Mm-hmm. And this administration stopped that. We don't know who's visiting the president going into the White House.
Hey, let's be honest with this president. I'm not sure he knows who's in the room with him.
Yeah, I think he knows because he let the Russians in there.
I don't know who he wants in there. I really, seriously,
yes,
it's very strange to me. But
well, I think I know who he wants in there, and that's the business cronies, because everything he's done has been pro-business.
Yeah. So you're saying that what's good for General Motors isn't necessarily good for America?
Is not necessarily good for America. Yeah. Simply put, I see the functioning of our country like a three-legged stool. It functioned well when there was government, business, and non-government organizations, nonprofits, churches. And we've had one of the legs of the stool pulled out by business taking over a lot of government operations. I mean, the FDA is captured, the EPA is captured. Now our public schools are captured by private. I mean, that's one thing that this administration did, is put business in charge of every one of those federal departments. So
prisons
a long time ago, yes, were privatized.
And if Mr. Prince has his way, the military to some degree is.
That's right. So anything to make a buck using taxpayers' dollars, getting taxpayers' dollars, moving it from our pockets to their pockets. And it doesn't. And now they're focused on the public school system to be able to privatize that and move the public tax dollars that we would send to the public schools over to the private charter schools, that sort of thing. So this was why I say it's been intentionally the velvet coup, that the subtitle of my book is The Velvet Coup That Cost Us Our Democracy, is that it was slow moving and nobody really saw it happening. And one reason why I called it the Velvet Coup was after the Czech Republic's Velvet Revolution. where a shot had never been fired in their revolution, and we've not had a shot fired. But the coup happened, and it happened very slowly.
So do you think that this is an organized process?
Yes, I think it's very organized.
Who's running the show?
Well, right now there are 5 men in the world that owns half the world's wealth. 3 of them are right here in our country. There are basically 20 people in our country that owns half of our country's wealth. So these are the people that are operating the administration and what's happening. Robert Mercer and Rebecca, his daughter, they're the ones that got our president in office now, and he's a multi-billionaire hedge fund owner. So I think it was Medallion. And so these are the people that are running our country and have abandoned the people because it doesn't serve their interests.
Mm-hmm. Well, so do you see these people getting together to talk about it? Do you see this small group of people?
Yes, they get together. The Koch brothers organize them every 6 months in Palm Springs.
Uh-huh.
They get together every 6 months. Probably the top 400 wealthiest people get together, and that's where they got the commitment of $800 million to fund the last campaign to try to put state Republican and Libertarian, and that's another thing to talk about, people into the city, school districts, state government. Mm-hmm. So yes, they do definitely get together and are organized.
And with that kind of scary thought,
yes,
we're going to have to take a break, but we'll be right back with Jill Cody to talk more about America Abandoned.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. Jill, we were just talking about the organization that goes on between the wealthiest people in this country and political process. And how do those political parties, the two you mentioned being the Republicans and the Libertarians, how does it work on their end of the spectrum?
Well, I think today's Republicans are libertarians. I don't see this as the Republican Party of yesteryear. One of my dearest friends who passed away a few years ago, he was a Republican. They were social progressives and fiscal conservatives. Even Nixon started the EPA. Mm-hmm. Teddy Roosevelt started the national monuments. I mean, they had we the people in mind. This is a different group. This is what I think is a libertarian party. And everybody likes the idea of libertarianism. You know, we're all free and able to do what we want. And I don't know if you will allow me to read a section from my book. Is that all right?
Sure, you can.
Okay. It's such a great story, Ken, that I want to get it right. And because libertarianism really started, their goddess is Ayn Rand, And her Superman character in her fictional books. Matter of fact, Paul Ryan, when he was elected to office, gave all of his staff people Ayn Rand's books and said, this is what we want. This is the government we want. Now, I would have liked to have heard that he gave everybody the Constitution, but no, it was Ayn Rand's fictional books. And so I hope you and your listeners will give me a couple minutes here, because this is a fascinating story that I don't think many people know about. And when I was doing my research, this is what I discovered. Ayn Rand was an atheist and founded the philosophy of objectivism, which states that we should pursue our own self-interest rather than pursuing the greater good for others. Somehow this should be done in the name of reason. If we reason properly, then we will realize that our own self-interest is paramount to anything or anyone else. In a perverse world, selfishness is moral. How cunning it is to present a potentially immoral act as moral. This is a central, profit-motivating message espoused by politicians, billionaires, corporate CEOs, because it justifies abandoning any responsibility for employees, customers, the environment, governments, and even the country. So much so that today, corporations no longer possess any economic loyalty to America. They outsource jobs and with their tax evasion loopholes. Free will does not come without responsibility, but the libertarian application in our society is responsibility free, and it is a prime factor of abandonment. Libertarian values foster abandonment. Those who admire Ayn Rand and her libertarian tenet that selfishness is good need to know something. Ayn Rand based her selfishness is good and her Superman concept and character in her novels on one of the most famous men in 1928, William Edward Hickman. William Edward Hickman said something that captured Ayn Rand's psyche. What is good for me is right. She zealously responded to this self-serving worldview by writing in her journal that he was a, quote, wonderful, free, light consciousness. She further explained that Hickman was unrestrained of any understanding of, quote, the necessity, meaning, or importance of other people. She also commented, quote, other people do not exist to him, and he doesn't understand why they should. She wrote these journal entries like accolades, something to applaud, as if these were good qualities of human character. Among his many other deplorable acts, William Edward Hickman kidnapped a 12-year-old girl from school, demanded a ransom from her parents, and killed and mutilated his captive anyway. To make the girl seem alive in his car, he wired her eyes shut, stuffed her with towels, and then, while escaping with the ransom, pushed her out of the car, forcing her father to forever be haunted by the visual of his daughter's body parts strewn all over the road. Rationally, one would think that's when Ayn Rand learned of this revolting crime, she would disavow the what is good for me is right philosophy. Nope. Instead, she wrote in defense of the sociopath in her journal, the first thing that impresses me about the case is the ferocious rage of a whole society against one man. No matter what the man did, there is always something loathsome in the virtuous indignation and mass hatred of the majority. It is repulsive to see all these things and worse sins and crimes in their own lives virtually condemning a criminal. So that is what libertarian is based on, is what is right for me is good. And corporations and the Libertarian Party we have in control just think that what's right for themselves, right for their funders that keep them there, is good. And so this is what we're dealing with, is the basis of a total selfish mindset.
A Superman.
A Superman.
Yes, to use Nietzsche's term. And of course, we also have, in that same Chicago tradition, Leopold and Loeb.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yes, and the mass murderer who haunted the World's Fair. That has been a tradition in the philosophy that has come out of Chicago. Chicago has a very, very strange approach to economics and philosophy that we tend not to see as part of the Weltanschauung, but it is. It is sadly this self-serving, psychopathic kind of approach, and Ayn Rand fit in beautifully.
Yes, and the Tea Party, that now the Freedom Caucus, they're still wagging the tail of the dog in Congress, and that's who they emulate.
But of course, they have another rationale, and I want to make sure we mention it because it sounds so brilliant at the time, and that is that they try and tie it to capitalism. And of course, capitalism, going back to Adam Smith, who was talking about a perfect world in which small businesses competed. He wasn't talking about the kind of corporations we have now, in which he said that the greed of people would lead to good decisions.
Yes.
But, of course, not only was he talking about a world in which people were in small businesses and competing, but the other thing was that he was very aware that the greed included the wanting to be held in high esteem in the community. The greed included the wanting to be respected. And most importantly, the greed included wanting to know that one was going to go to heaven, that one was a virtuous person. And of course, this was in England, where the virtuous person also had the king or the queen now going, "I dub you, sir, good person." So there's all this distortion in the glorification. Now, not all libertarians, I want to make a point here that not all libertarians are of that ilk. I personally, one of the first political figures that I supported was a guy from here in Arizona named Barry Goldwater. And I thought he was a pretty decent human being. I got to meet him, and, he believed in government. And I started out my life as a Republican. But I was an Ed Brooke Republican. I was a Maggie Smith Republican.
A Maggie Smith Republican, yes.
Now that's a very different animal.
Oh, yes, that's not the animal we have. That's why I read that section and want people to realize the libertarian philosophy that's permeated the Republican Party. If I was what I call a classic Republican, I'd be outraged that the name of my party's been stolen and turned into something that really is not what any of us would want.
So now before we take another break, I want to make sure that people know how to find copies of America Abandoned. So do you have, I know they're available on Amazon. Okay?
Yes, and they can be ordered at any bookstore.
Bookstores.
At any bookstore, and also there's a link on my AmericaAbandoned.com website.
Okay, AmericaAbandoned.com.
Yes,
okay, folks.
Thank you.
And I'm sure there's other great stuff there where people can read some of your ideas and stuff.
Yes, blogs and things like that, yes.
So, folks, enjoy this break, and we'll be right back, Walking on the Weene Side.
Hi there, my name is Jill Cody. Welcome. Are you puzzled about how our country became what it is today, completely unresponsive to our needs? Are you like I was, feeling upset and powerless? I wanted to find the answers, so for the past 2.5 years, I researched our history for key decision points and faithfully listened to thought leaders I trusted. After taking this information in, it dawned on me that America has experienced a velvet coup. What do I mean by a velvet coup? Several years ago, I facilitated and assisted in coordinating an international meeting at St. Charles University in Prague, the Czech Republic. While I was there, I learned about their history of when they broke away from the Soviet Union. They called it their Velvet Revolution because never a shot was fired. It is my thesis that during the past 35 years, America has experienced a coup without a shot being fired. I have identified 22 seminal moments that map the Velvet Coup's progress, with its launch initiated through a memo written in 1971 by Lewis Powell, Jr., a corporate attorney, and who a year later became a Supreme Court justice. The memo was written to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and was titled Attack on American Free Enterprise System. In this manifesto, he pitted corporations and the American people against each other. He struck fear into corporate executives by telling them that if they did not get involved in politics, they were participating in their own destruction, and that their very survival was at stake. The coup was launched, and corporate leaders around the country began undertaking plans to make sure we, the people, did not get in their way with regulations and making maximum profits. Later that decade, another seminal moment was the Supreme Court's decision, now with Lewis Powell Jr. sitting on the court, bestowed onto money free speech rights. Known as the Buckley versus Vallejo decision, the Supreme Court gave money the ability to talk legally. Think about this. The result being that the more money someone had, the more free speech rights they possessed. Corporations and billionaires were vaulted over the middle class. This was one of several powerful and strategic Velvet Coup accomplishments. Fast forward to 2010, and the Supreme Court once again, in a Velvet Coup masterstroke, extended to corporations full rights to spend as much money as their executives desired in candidate elections and ballot initiatives at any governmental level they wanted. That conservative Supreme Court reversed 100 years of precedents that protected the people and the country's elections from corporate and billionaire dominance. What possibly could go wrong? When the coup was launched in 1971, there were only 175 lobbyists. Now there are 13,000 of them, overpowering our elected representatives. CEO pay since 1978 has increased by 940%, while their employees' paychecks only went up 10.3%. According to a joint Princeton and Northwestern University study of nearly 1,800 bills passed by Congress, they determined that, quote, the average American appears to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. That is a lot of adjectives to prove a point. It is time to take a stand and take back America from the corporations and billionaires. Instead of feeling frustrated, angry, helpless, hopeless, divided, and fearful, we all, every one of us, has to get involved and become active. Voting is no longer enough. It is just the beginning. What can you do to recapture, reignite, and re-engage in America? First, you must decide you will. Can you no longer sit on the sidelines? I have many ideas for you in my book, America Abandoned. Thank you, and I invite you to visit my website to find activities where you can stand up for America.
Hi folks, welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. And as you know, we're talking with Jill Cody about her very fascinating book, America Abandoned. Now, folks, we want you to buy the book and read it. So I'm not going to ask Jill to give you the whole book. But I do want her to share with us a few of the historical, I guess I could say highlights, but I really want to say lowlights. Of the process of the coup, the Velvet Coup that has been taking over our democracy.
So the purpose of the Velvet Coup was just to get government out of the way. Government gets in the way of corporations and billionaires. That's the only entity large enough to fight them. I'm not large enough to fight a corporation. I'm sure people listening and watching aren't either, but government on our behalf is large enough and has the energy and resources to confront a corporation. So one of their main purposes is just get government out of the way. And that means demonizing regulations. Governmental regulations get in their way and it costs them money. So we have to demonize them. But when we really think about what regulations are, which are rules of capitalism, as you were talking about before in the last segment, the greed that happens. Well, there's rules of the game to try to tamp down that greed and make sure that everyone is playing fairly, at least leveling the playing field where all of the companies and businesses work from. But they get in the way, they cost money, but they're rules, like a baseball game. We wouldn't play baseball without rules, but we're now playing capitalism without rules.
Hey,
but
you know what? This kind of reminds me when I was a kid growing up and I'd want to play a game with my older brother, and he'd keep changing the rules on me.
There you go. What a great analogy. That's right. And then also we know that corporations need to find profit opportunities anywhere they can. And so that's the idea of the concept behind business can do it better, is if they can start getting into the democratic commons, things like roads and fire departments and police departments and sewage treatment plants, and the school system and the prisons. Those were our democratic commons, things that we can't have on our own. I can't have my own sewage treatment plant. I mean, I want to just know when I flush the toilet, it's just gone. I don't want to have my own police department. We come together so that all of us have that. But they want to be able to make a profit off those things. And then, therefore, we pay more and they get more from our pocket to theirs. And then they also is maximizing those profits to enrich stockholders and CEOs. But where I mentioned this, where it really got launched was Lewis Powell. He was a corporate attorney, and he wrote a memo, now called the Powell Manifesto, on August 23rd, 1971. And that's when he wrote a memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and basically said that corporations have to get involved in politics or they'll be part of their own demise. And that scared the CEOs. And that's when they started getting lobbyists and started looking at how government got in their way. And then Powell was appointed by Nixon to be on the Supreme Court. And when he was on the Supreme Court, one of the most important Supreme Court decisions happened back then, which is Buckley versus Valeo. It was in 1976. And that's where the Supreme Court gave money constitutional free speech. So money can talk now, literally, was given that power. Then after that, Boston versus Bellotti, I think, the Supreme Court then gave corporations free speech rights. So now we have corporations that can have a lot more money than you and I can, with the money having free speech. Then another big time was David Koch running on the Libertarian platform. And I have that in the book, but the Libertarian platform that he ran on was no public education, no Social Security, no Medicare, just a free-for-all, just what would lead to chaos in this country because we're such a complicated country. Then also in the 80s was what was called the Goo-Goo Syndrome speech. Did you know about that? Have you heard of the Goo-Goo Syndrome speech?
Go ahead.
That was Paul Weyrich gave a speech, and you can find it on the internet, about talking about everybody has this good government kind of philosophy, and he didn't want good government. People think everybody should vote, and he didn't want everybody to vote, because when people didn't vote, then that's when they won. And so that's the beginning of suppressing our votes and stealing the votes, because they don't want everybody to vote. Corporations know that that's the only thing, the only power we have left in our hands is our vote. So whatever they can do to make it miserable, they will. Then there was a repeal of Glass-Steagall, and that was the one that separated the investment side of banking and the savings account side of banking. Take that down, and then banks were able to use savings account money and checking account money to gamble with. And we saw what happened with the Wall Street nearly bankrupting the country in 2008.
Actually, what
yeah.
we did, we saw something even worse because when all of that gambling that was going on, both by the insurance industry, the banking industry, and the loan side of businesses like General Motors, all of them
Yes.
lending all this money, it became very clear that we wouldn't let it go bankrupt and that we would protect them against us. And one of the things that infuriated me was that banks were allowed to foreclose on mortgages that people who had been paying until they lost their jobs, until the economy went south, then they were able to foreclose while the government was giving them money because they were losing, the banks were losing money, instead of giving the money as a second or third mortgage on those houses as a loan to the people.
Yes. Well, that shows you the power of the corporations being in charge.
Yeah.
They're the ones that abandoned the people, and there's their power just playing right out there. Absolutely right.
Well, before we run out of time, and because this book, I want folks, you get an idea how interesting this topic is, huh? Please read the book. But now, there's an area in particular where corporations, I think, have been incredibly irresponsible, and that's called the environment.
Yes.
And, you know, one of the things that really strikes me is, I don't know, but most people, and I will guess most of the listeners to It Matters Radio, care a lot about the world we live in. You know, we separate our trash. We try and keep down the amount of trash. I know in our home we try not to throw out a lot of food, but to use leftovers wisely and intelligently. I separate, you know, I use, as an author, I use a lot of paper. I'm sorry, I have to. But I recycle it. I don't throw it in with my garbage. I throw it into the recycling.
And use the FSI paper. The other logo is the industry logo, and it's a sham. But the FSI paper is certified sustainable forest. So just had to throw that in.
And recycled paper.
Yes. And recycling the things, yeah.
So, you know, we all of us, or most of us, try to do what we can. And it's like spitting into the wind.
Yes.
The corporations, and to be honest, the government, all the while that they're talking at us about this and trying to make money from us by, for example, selling us products that are labeled, they really do very little. And one of the worst things, of course, just as an aside from my point of view, is they keep bombing and shooting off guns and things. Like, all of that stuff they're doing, all those bombs, are not hurting the environment. But I know, because of your work with Vice President Gore, that you're pretty concerned about the environment, and I wanted you to tell, are you working on a new book now?
I'm working on Climate Abandoned. Thank you, Ken, for asking. I'm working on Climate Abandoned because we've also in this country, not other countries, many countries are doing what they need to do, but in this country, our politicians and our decision makers have abandoned the climate and the environment. Again, because it costs corporations, to say the coal industry, it costs corporations to process their trailings. So the very first executive order that Trump did was tell them that they can now, they don't have to process the trailings anymore. They can just take a tractor and push them in the river and streams.
Absolutely, you know, but the government isn't much better. You know, we were up, I'm trying to remember the name of the river, and it's escaping me right now, but the one in Colorado that then comes down into the Navajo reservation, and the EPA screwed up the dam and let the uranium tailings come into the river.
Yes.
Yes. You know, it is one of the things that we need in this country, I think, and maybe in the world as a large, is we need a panel of, okay, we'll call them philosophers after Plato and Socrates. Well, we need those wise men and women who are watching us and saying, wait a minute, guys, only a foolish bird goes to the bathroom in its own nest. And you guys are about the dumbest birds in the forest.
Well, and I would add to that we as individuals must vote. We can't throw away our vote. We can't throw away the birthright we've given. And we need to vote more wisely and see if the people that we're electing support environmental issues and climate change issues. We can't be, people in Oklahoma can't be reelecting people like Inhofe, who thinks climate change is a hoax and throws a snowball on the Senate floor. I mean, we have to be smarter in who we're electing because we're putting our trust into them. And because the coup took 40 years, we have slowly seen our federal departments captured. So yes, we're going to start seeing things happen like you talked about with the dam, because our departments have been captured over decades. So there's just a whole nother group of people that we need to have elected, and also people that will say that they will undo Citizens United as well, because that's another big corporate coup, was that ruling.
Now, folks, when we talk about who we vote for, it isn't so easy because there are so many issues, and they're going to get to vote on many, many issues. And you may not agree with any one politician on 100%. God knows I've never found a politician I agree with 100%.
Me either.
Okay, but what's much more important is that if you take time to be politically involved, not just voting, but you're one of the people who goes to the organizing meetings. You're one of the people who offers to be a delegate. You're one of the people who are working on campaigns. And you go and you say to a candidate or an elected official, wait a minute, Joe. Wait a minute, Ebony, whatever. You know, you haven't been doing what you told me when I talked to you. You were not doing. You're moving away from these values. And you either have to convince me that somehow or other what you've done is consistent with the values in ways I don't see, or I'm becoming your enemy. And the next nominating committee, guess who's going to be saying, no, we don't want this guy back. We don't want this lady in office.
And there's a perfect example of how that worked. I call them peak citizens. You know, you can vote and that's minimal, but if you're a peak citizen, that you're really active on your phone and sending postcards to your representatives and you're out there at those meetings, town hall meetings. But look what happened with the Affordable Care Act.
We'll be right back to talk about that.
Political season is at its height right now, and we're all glad to be Americans because we live in a democracy. Well, wait. Is this really a democracy?
America is not a democracy.
You see, I was talking with this guy.
My name is Ben Swan.
He does a lot of journalism about our political system.
And I am a reporter and anchor with WXIX TV in Cincinnati. I'm also the host and producer of Reality Check.
And I was trying to figure out what he meant. So we started talking about ancient Greece.
Ancient Greece was a democracy. The people had the ultimate say. So, for instance, in the case of the healthcare law, instead of having lawmakers who would draft a bill and vote on a bill and then let the people know what the decision was, they would write a bill, a healthcare bill, and then all the people would go to the polls and the people would vote. And if the majority of the people said we like the healthcare law, it would become law. And if the majority of people said we don't like it, then it wouldn't become law. Everything would be based upon majority rules. But when the founders created our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, they established a form of government, and they actually determined that a democracy was the worst form of government.
The worst form of government?
Many of the founders said that democracy was nothing more than mob rule, and so they were against democracy and instead felt the correct form of government for this free nation was a republic.
Ah, yes, a republic. Yeah, to the republic for which it stands. and stuff like that. So what's a republic?
Well, a republic is a form of government. Let me start that again. A republic is a form of government where the people will go to the polls to elect men and women who represent them. And then those elected leaders create and vote on laws. The people don't vote directly on laws that affect their life. Rather, it's lawmakers who are chosen among the people. And these are supposed to be the best, the smartest, the most ethical, the most moral, the most upright men and women in a society who represent the majority of society. And that's the form of government we have in the United States. The other thing that's important to understand is the distinction between democracy and a republic is that a democracy is the rule of man ruling over each other, which our founders believe turns into mob rule. A republic is the rule of law. Laws are formed and created as a Bill of Rights or a Constitution, and then those laws are never superseded by mob rule or superseded by elected officials. They are all under law. So republic is actually the rule of law.
You heard it here. We are ruled by law in a republic. Let's go elect some officials then. Ben, thanks for talking.
Welcome back, folks. You know, it isn't very often that we get into a fourth segment here. But, you know, I'm just having so much fun talking with Jill Cody today. And you were just bringing up the Affordable Care Act, Jill.
Yes, I wanted to give people hope because what you explained, we just had a perfect example of, which was the Affordable Care Act. The Republicans wanted, as they've said, and tried to destroy it for years, and they finally have, the House and the Senate and the presidency, and they could do something, and they did nothing because people went out to the town halls. People stopped them. They did exactly what you said. And so that's what people need to wake up to. All of us need to wake up to that is to take our power back. I think a lot of us have given up our power thinking, oh, my vote doesn't count. Oh, nobody listens to me. But if your voice joins 1,000 other people's voices, or even 500 or 300 at that town hall, and you express to your representative the displeasure, it works. And we just had a perfect example where the Affordable Care Act was saved. Yes, it's going to need changes, but now they're talking. They've got a bipartisan group talking about how to fix the existing Affordable Care Act instead of just throwing people off of health care.
I want to just point out one thing that I personally believe very strongly, and I love this country. I've voted in every election of my life.
Me too.
Even for dog catcher. I mean, I try to vote on everything.
Me too.
But I also know my history. And I know this country didn't start out with a vote. Mm-hmm. It started out, sadly, with blood. As those who caught my interview with Patrick Hebage, for example, know, it started with Blood in the Snow, is the title of one of his plays. And I'm a great lover of France. I've been there many times. I love France. And I always think to myself, are we willing as a country to have barricades in the street? Are we willing to shed our blood, not to free Europe from fascists or, God help us, save Vietnam from communists, some foolishness like that? Are we ready to shed our blood to keep America free of itself? And when I think of that, the thing that comes to my mind, and perhaps the note I want to end on today, is we in this country are blessed by diversity. We in this country are cursed by diversity. Mm-hmm. Which way it goes, blessing or curse, is up to us. Mm-hmm. From the very beginnings of this country's history, there have been those who tried to keep power, and it isn't just recent. It goes back to who was going to get paid the debts from the Revolutionary War. I mean, the first issue of whether it's going to be the businessmen or the individuals. And of course, at that time, under Hamilton's direction, the government honored the debts that have been bought up on pennies on the dollar to the businesses, rather than giving the businesses back their pennies and giving the soldiers, the veterans, the full value. And which I thought was, when I studied in history, was a horrible thing, a horrible choice. And we have, those kinds of things historically. And then the question of, do we respect one another? Do we draw on the diversity to appreciate that Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, or European, that we all come together and work together toward a common cause, a common sense of an America that we all love and serve. And I think it happens at this moment in our history, perhaps more than any other. That question is being raised because so much of what is going on in Washington right now is directed to the issue of diversity. And one of the things is Dreamers, which of course anybody who's listened to It Matters Radio knows. We very strongly believe that the Dreamers should become American citizens.
Yes.
However, I'm strangely agree with Mr. Trump that it's up to Congress. And we as citizens should be holding Congress to the fire and saying, hey, we're all one. These guys, these girls, they deserve to be here. Stop this pushing it aside and playing this divisive politics, and give by acclamative vote. It should be a universal vote that if they have tried to be Americans and been brought up to be Americans, that we recognize that. It is time for us as a country to rise above those who would use diversity to divide us.
Yes, yes. Well, you hit it on the head with respect, because there have been many pressures, mainly by, I would say, right-wing radio and TV, to tell people, no, don't respect the other. I mean, you don't respect, divide and conquer. And that was exactly what the corporations and the billionaires' purpose and intent. As long as we're fighting each other, as long as we're fighting each other on a variety of social issues, we're not watching what they're doing. We're not watching that Sinclair, who's more to the right than Fox News, is probably going to buy every local television station in the country. Mm-hmm. So your local news will now not be just straight news. It's going to have an opinion and a mandated talking point. So we have to overcome the messages of the other guy is bad, demonizing the other person, and start respecting. And that's just at a human level. But if we start getting our power back and we start respecting people of all heritages, and as Americans, then we might have a chance to recapture our democracy. Right now we're living in an oligarchy, and our current president would love to have it be a totalitarianism. I mean, a corporation is not a democracy. So when you're a high-powered business person, you're used to totalitarian methods. You give this order and make people do what you want. But that's not what democracy is. So we do need to start respecting each other.
Yeah, I agree. One last note, because I don't want anybody to think that we are telling you that every rich person is the enemy.
Oh, good point.
There are some very
good point.
Fine, wealthy men and women who have great values, who try to give back to the community, and really have no such part in this kind of overall worldview that they should be running everything. And let's not condemn them.
Right. There is actually a group called the Patriotic Millionaires that are just about that, where they ask the government to tax them more.
Yes.
because they appreciate a civil society and they appreciate that we need our institutions for them to succeed. I'm just afraid to say that they're not in the 0.01% as the Koch brothers are and the ones that are making the decisions, the libertarian type of decisions. But yes, you're absolutely right.
So, folks, I've been having the great pleasure today of talking with Jill Cody, whose book, America Abandoned, and you can see a copy right there over her right shoulder, is very well worth your reading. And she has another one called Climate Abandoned that she is working on, and I'm sure, hoping that she will send me a copy when it's ready and that you'll come on and join us on Walking on the Weene Side.
Be my pleasure, Ken.
Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for the opportunity.